Alright, welcome to Chapter 5, and this is continuing our lectures in the kind of subcategory of the police. We're going to be looking at some of the problems and some of the solutions that have been proposed to solve these problems in modern policing. So we'll look at some more modern departments, we'll look at a few issues that have come up, and again, this typically starts with our learning objectives. These are the broad concepts we're seeking to look at in this particular chapter, and of course they fit into broader ideas inside the course. Again, you don't have to know these verbatim. These are just to give you an introduction about what we're seeking to accomplish with this chapter. Again, as I frequently do, I'm going to start this chapter with some questions. These are questions that you should ask as you're reading them, questions that you should think about. So the first one there, how is what we know about the police shaped by our support or opposition to how they act? So is what you know now different than what you knew in the past about the police? Does your age affect this? Does your ethnic group, does your racial group impact our attitude here? I'm an older attorney who taught at the Raleigh Police Academy for years for Wake Tech. I know many of the senior police officers in Raleigh and some of the surrounding areas. So my attitude is probably different than someone who just moved here, say from a foreign country. Those are all things that would impact it. But you should have some unique ones, and you should think about how they impact it, and of course how these could be played out among others. What are the multiple functions of the police, particularly beyond the idea that the police just fight crime? And does the public really accept that there are these multiple functions? Do they even understand it? And the last one is playing back again to that same theme. I know we're going to come back to it over and over, the ethno and chronocentrism. How is the public perception of the police changing now that it is 2020? And why? What's driving it? Is it a cultural change? Is it a technological change? One of the things I think that's most helpful here is go back and look at old TV programs and old movies of the police. And, if you go back to the 1920s and how they behave even when they're being good guys, you'd be pretty shocked. The degree of force and interrogation, the so-called third degree you'd see. But we expected that of them. And of course, for a while in the United States, there was something called the Hayes Office, which said you couldn't have a negative depiction of a police officer in a major motion picture. So that certainly shaped how a whole generation of people grew up believing the people were, because our popular images were formed by the popular media. Those times have changed. Okay, the first micro lecture here, we're going to hit it right off. I'm going to talk about the Durham Police Department. It's one of the largest local police departments, and I know I tend to focus on Raleigh because of my connections with them. But in 2016, just a few years ago, a study was done on its operation and management by the International Association of Police. And I just want to introduce that to you, and I want to share you some links so that if you're interested in a lot of these topics in a little bit more detail, that'll be a helpful resource for you. Okay, the first thing to remember when we're talking about the police, the modern police, is it is a bureaucracy. And it is a bureaucracy that is based upon a military structure. You can look at this as a pyramid with the bulk of the officers at the bottom of the pyramid, and it goes up to the top, and at the top of the pyramid is the chief of police. So it's hierarchical in nature. We say a pyramid is a hierarchy. So there are inside any organization, any hierarchy, there are formal rules and there are informal rules. So the goal is to, at least in theory from your book, to reach maximum efficiency. I'm not so sure that's always the goal of all hierarchies. We certainly could talk about a few exceptions to that rule, but you also have to remember that there are limited resources in these hierarchies, and this plays against the formal and informal rules that exist. So you're going to try to provide what you deem to be the best service with the limited resources you have. And it's going to be impacted by things like how many people do you have to patrol. You know, if you're up in Alaska and you're patrolling rural Alaska, you've got a huge geographical area and a relatively small population. So you're only going to have a few police officers per, hundreds of miles. Also, what your budget is. There are some police departments that are very well funded. Locally, an example there would be the Cary Police Department. And then if you were to go to a state like, say, Mississippi, and you went to some of the rural counties in Mississippi, you'd find they're very poor. So those would both play into the idea of the structure in the organization. Okay, so as I said, we have a pyramid, and at the top of this pyramid, we have the person running it, which is, as I said, typically the chief of police. Now, sometimes different departments will adopt different terminology for the individuals inside the organization. I'm going to use the ones that are probably most familiar to people, and these are military ranks. So, for example, you would see in a mid-sized police department, you would see the chief of police, and he usually doesn't have a rank besides chief. But below him, you frequently will see the term running his departments as majors, and then below those you'll see captains, and then below those you see lieutenants, sergeants, and then you're going to see patrol officers. So obviously the higher up you are, the more authority you have to give to people underneath you. And each one of these departments, each one of these levels of this pyramid, okay, are divided into different departments and into different shifts. So the biggest one's going to be patrol, but you're going to have special operations units, you're going to have investigation units, all these are going to exist. So the core idea that the police are seen, at least by the public, as performing is patrol. You cannot watch a TV channel from probably 1950 in America to the year 2020 and not see a police officer driving around in a car. So, if you go all the way back, even comedies, there was a truly awful show in the 1950s called Car 54, Where Are You? But beyond that, there was TV programs like Adam 12 in the 1960s. And then if you flash forward to today, one of the ones that I've seen on TV, there's a TV show called The Rookie, which focuses on a rookie police officer in Los Angeles in modern-day America, and much of the time you see him driving around or riding in his car. So all departments will usually have these patrol units. They are clearly, or almost always, the largest particular unit. And what are their purposes, as stated? Well, their purposes are deterring crime, giving the public a sense of security, providing services. And one of the services that's overlooked here, and this is not the first time I mentioned this, but it's dealing with mental illness. Now, you probably weren't expecting a unit on policing to talk about mental illness, but this is a very significant problem in society. 7 to 10% of the contacts that are made by police officers with the public, and we're talking about in situations where there's problems, not when they're just driving on the street, they're going to come across individuals that are going to be somewhere on the scale of mental illness. So it could be a mild, they could come across someone who was combative or aggressive, they could come across someone who's schizophrenic, they could come across someone who's delusional. So it is not uncommon. And in many ways, the police are the first responders for mental illness in our society. Okay, so how can we break the patrol activity down? So about 40% of the patrol is simply driving around. This is called preventive patrol. It's the largest single grouping of it. And this is maintaining a presence in the community. People, at least people who aren't committing crimes, like to see police officers in their neighborhood. It gives them a sense of security, and police departments play on this. So Raleigh Police Department, for example, lets officers take their squad cars home and park those cars in a public area where they're visible. This maintains a presence in the community. So police officers, and that's even off duty, police officers about 40% of the time are literally just with the expression, old expression, showing the flag. Now, about 25% of the time, only about a quarter of their day, they're responding to a call. Most of these calls are going to be very, very minor. Most of these calls are not something that's absolutely critical. But occasionally, that'll happen. The next largest one is paperwork. There is a tremendous amount of paperwork in any bureaucracy, and police bureaucracies are no exception to this rule. I guess since the invention of writing with Hammurabi and the Sumerians back in the 2,000-3,000 BC, whatever we're talking about here, since then people have been filling out forms and answering questions. So if you're going to be a police officer, one of the things, for example, you're going to be trained to do is how to write a police report. What needs to be in it? How clear does it need to be? And this is not an unimportant job that they do. Then there's the kind of office, the smallest percentage, although it's one I think that patrol officers often find very rewarding, is officer-initiated interactions with citizens. And when I say rewarding, I don't mean when they become suspicious and stop someone. I mean when they see someone that might need help, or assist someone, or establish a more positive relationship in the community. Of course, some of these time they will, see a crime occur, or see a suspect they know that there's a warrant out for, or be required really to arrest someone. So this is something probably that both challenges officers a little bit more and is of great interest to them. Besides patrol, we have investigation. Now, this is a reactive event, and there can be two dichotomous things that go on. Either something is proactive, it is dealing with it before, or it is reactive, it is dealing with it after. So police investigation is a reactive event. Someone calls the police, something has happened, and the police investigate the crime. So it is not the deterrence of crime here, although there may be some of that by an efficient and effective investigation that's widely known, but it is a reaction. It is solving the crime. So primarily, the people that do this are detectives, and they are promoted up from patrol officer. Now, it is not as glamorous as you might see in the movies. A lot of this work detectives do, and they go by different names in different organizations. The English tend to use the term inspectors as opposed to detectives, but detectives are certainly used across the United States as a general term. You're going to spend most of your time as a police detective, if we look at all the detectives and all the work they do, investigating property crime, because property crime is more reported than crimes of violence, and property crime is something that society deems to be important to investigate. So it's investigating things like burglary or shoplifting. Undercover operations, this is something I think that's way overstated in the popular media, and people can form the wrong idea that police officers are constantly going undercover. So again, you see TVs, movies, broadcasts where there's lots of undercover operations, and certainly the police do have undercover operations, but it's not very common. They can utilize officers using false identification, but probably the most common type of undercover operation is the use of CIs, or confidential informants. So you have someone that's already kind of embedded in the criminal community. Often this is a lower level drug dealer, or a lower level prostitute, or someone that has come in contact with the police in the past and is willing to assist the police, or be compelled to assist the police because of the situation they're in. So confidential informants are developed by the police and used by the police more than undercover police officers. Now we're going to talk about special weapons units. Now, the term comes into the language in the 1970s as SWAT, Special Weapons and Tactics. That's not the term that many of these special weapons units like to use, but it is kind of the default term that is used by the general public. From the law enforcement perspective, these special weapons units are used for high-risk operations. And what they do is they're going to provide a greater ability to deploy force and a higher level of protection for the individuals engaged in it, for the police. So often you'll see them execute no-knock warrants where they believe that the individual is dangerous. Now, from a civil libertarian perspective, the shift from protecting the public to protecting the police is a little bit problematical. So some people criticize the rise of special weapon units. We'll talk about some of those issues there. So when are SWAT units deployed? High-risk armed offenders or suspects or searches, siege or barricade incidences with armed or dangerous offenders, domestic counterterrorism, and of course hostage rescue. Those would be four common ones. The controversial one, and this is really a micro lecture that we'll turn to, and that is, it's a Japanese expression. When you have a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. One of the things that we found is when SWAT units are created in departments, they're used. And it's like, well, of course they're used. Yeah, but you have to worry that they're used in situations where nonviolence might have been possible. So the military mentality is not particularly adapted to modern policing, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more in lecture 5.2. So if you're interested, tune into that one. I'm going to give you a slide here. I like this slide, in particular because our department head, Janie Slaughter, is was a huge fan of Mayberry RFD, and you'll see a picture there of Andy and Barney, which was kind of the stereotypical idea of the cop, at least as Hollywood portrayed him in the 1960s. And then you look at the stereotypical cop today, and they look like something closer to a Star Wars stormtrooper. Not a stormtrooper in the sense if we were to use the German term. But the other illustration is a little more accurate. This is how a combative unit, say the one that was at the Chicago Democratic Convention in 1968, was dressed. And you'll notice they had on a regular blue shirt. They did have a gas mask, and they did carry a club. By 1990, you'll notice that they have flak jackets on. They have really a different ability to contact. And then by 2011, you'll notice that we've really gone full-bore military. And the police have a lot more of a military appearance, even if it's not an application. Okay, solving crime, because after all, that's what the public expects the police to do. The police tend to use the term clearance rate, and that's simply the percentage of crimes that are solved. And there really are, and this is one of those facts most public don't know, they're really pretty low in a lot of ways. Violent crimes, as of 2012, fix that slide, we solve about 45% of them. And property crimes, we only solve about 20% of them. So there's a significant issue of solving or not solving crime. So a lot of crimes are going to go unsolved. If a crime goes unsolved within a certain amount of time, we call it a cold case, and depending upon the type of cases we're looking at, they're going to have very low arrest rates. You'll sometimes hear police officers, departments, or analysts talk about the golden 48 or the golden 72. And by that means if you can solve a crime, you're very often going to solve it in the first day or 2 days or 3 days. But the longer the crime is not solved, the less likely it will ever be solved because the case has gone cold. Which is not to say that sometimes we don't have these major breakthroughs in the past, new technology or evidence is developed, but it's a rarity. Forensic investigation is a popular thing. I think this became very popular. Again, public media played a big role here with the rise of certain television programs, even as far back as the 1980s, with programs like Quincy, which focused on medical examiners determining death, or in the 1990s, or recently with programs like CSI. So you're very often going to see the application of scientific tools and techniques to solve crime. And certainly it's a very valuable thing if the police can use science to produce certain answers. So forensics, for example, can often determine the cause of death, why someone died. That's pretty important. I mean, if it's a natural occurrence, it's not a crime. If it's a homicide, well, if it's a murder, it's a crime. When did someone die? That can rule out or include suspects, what type of weapons were used, who the victim is, even who the offender is. There are different disciplines inside forensics. So we have one of the big ones is ballistics, which is really going to study firearms, bullets, and guns. And that came about in the early part of the 20th century. We began to understand that every bullet fired from a rifled gun had a unique pattern. And we're talking about bullets, not shotguns. It's a little bit different there. Trace evidence can be very important. Of course, fingerprints. By the turn of the century, we were pretty sure that fingerprints were unique. Blood types, hair types, biological markers. All of those are important for trace evidence. Recently, things like DNA. Electronic forensics, using computers or cells or video records. I tell my clients, or told my clients when I had an office, that you need to understand that you are fish swimming in an electronic sea, that you are constantly bumping up against machines that are making some record of where you are and when you're there. So when you take a cell phone call, or when you make a cell phone call, there's going to be a record of where you are and when that occurred. And that's going to fix you in time and geography. And that can be really important in establishing innocence or guilt. Then we have some more exotic forensic disciplines that still are very important. Entomology, which is the use of bugs. Believe it or not, bugs are very important if you find a body. They can tell you when someone died, because bugs will colonize bodies at different times after death, depending what time of year it is, what the temperature is, all of those. Anthropology, that can tell you things like, well, you found a footprint. You often can tell how heavy someone was, even how tall someone is by a footprint. And there are other exotic fields. Let's talk a little bit about DNA. Now, DNA in the double helix form really wasn't discovered until the 1960s. Watson and Crick, the two scientists who won the Nobel for it, there's actually a woman involved in it too, but she didn't get much credit, really came up with our modern approach to DNA, the helix. But only slowly did this make its way into policing, because we didn't have tests. We knew DNA existed. We were unsure of some of the rarity or the complexity of it. By the 1990s, we were pretty sure that if we could recover a sample, a very, very small sample, of any part of a person's body that's been cast off, whether it was blood or semen or hair or skin, and we could be sure it was from a person, we could identify who that person was if we had another sample. So labs can create DNA profiles of suspects, and if they have someone that the police thinks, if they have some DNA they recovered at a scene and they think, okay, we think Bob is our criminal, they can compare it. The big issue here is, what do you do if you don't have a DNA sample on profile? So it happens sometimes, in a horrific case like a rape, where the police will recover semen or a hair sample from the victim that was from the perpetrator. They'll run the DNA sample, they'll run it through a database, and they have no match. And that means that person has never had to provide a sample to law enforcement or any associated agencies. DNA sampling greatly increases the chance that a crime, particularly a crime of violence that is focused on, will be solved. So one of the things you have to ask is, what kind of database should exist? And this same question could be dealt with even more primitive technology like fingerprints. When I was admitted to the bar, I had to provide fingerprint samples to the North Carolina State Bar. I also provided blood samples when I was in the United States military. If you're in the military today, you provide a DNA sample. This is in part so that if you go missing and only part of your body or bodies are recovered, that we can determine, yes, it was you. But it also means that for people that aren't lawyers or aren't in the military or haven't been arrested, there's no DNA for them. So we're trying to broaden the amount of ways in which we can track things using DNA. And of those 4 new development there, let me just touch familial searches. So let's suppose that someone is on Ancestry.com and they do that 23andMe, and those samples are out there. And the police recover some DNA from a sign, and they go to the company 23andMe or one of the other companies, and they say, we would like you to see if this sample exists. And they'll run it through and they say, no, it's not. But this sample shares 12.5% of the same genetic material as Tom Jones. We'll make up a name. Well, that means that Tom Jones's parents had 25%. Tom Jones's grandparents had 50% of the same, and Tom's great-great-grandparents, the one that we know, okay, was the same as this person, because every generation you're going to lose half. That means that if you can find the descendants of the person you know down to the 3rd generation, you can find who this is. It's the way in which you can trace without having a sample, but you have to have a broad enough database. Okay, let's talk about what works. Calls for service. Operational basis of police work is incident-driven. The police, and I had already talked about reactive or proactive, the police are largely reactive. The crime occurs, they get the report, they respond. It is very, very common that police departments are rated on their response time. How fast do they get to the scene of the crime? I beg you not to believe that response time is the absolute standard to measure. Because what you have to remember is, while it's certainly possible that the police get a call because the crime is ongoing, most police calls are after the crime occurred. It is not as critical that they get to the scene of the crime as you might believe. It's certainly a good thing. It certainly instills respect in the public. We certainly put a lot of money into it. But response time is not as important as I would say good police work is. However, it is a way that you can easily measure. And to be honest about it, sometimes if you can measure something, it makes it more important than if you can't. How do you measure if someone's a good person? That's really hard. But I can measure how tall they are. Oh, okay. How do you measure if it's a good police department? Well, I don't know, but I can tell you how fast they get to the scene of the crime. So sometimes, since it's difficult to measure more complex things, we wind up measuring what we can. Okay, police patrols. Randomized patrol is the most common way in which the police traditionally did their policing. And in the 1970s, there was a fascinating study done in Kansas City. So if you'll follow me quickly, this is what happened. They broke Kansas City into, and I'm going to simplify this, 3 zones. Zone A, Zone B, Zone C. Zone A, they left alone. That's your control. So they know that X number of crimes, let's say burglaries, 50 burglaries occurred in Zone A. Okay. Zone B, they pulled all the police off the street. The police did not patrol. They responded, but they didn't patrol randomly. In Zone C, they doubled the number of police patrolling. So then they looked at the number of burglaries that occurred inside Zones B and C. So Zone B, with no police, you would expect, well, burglaries must have gone up. Zone C, oh, we had twice as many cops, burglaries must have gone down. In fact, that didn't happen at all. Random patrols had almost no impact on the crime rate. So putting police in cars and driving around, one person said, made as much sense as putting firemen in their trucks and having them drive around looking for fires. It just is a waste of resources. But there's something else here. People operate based upon perception. People feel better if they see police officers. So police officers patrol. Directed patrols are a little bit different. Directed patrols focus on specific types of crimes at specific times in specific areas. They show a little bit better results. But these randomized general patrols, they simply aren't much bang for your buck. Alright, so that Kansas City experiment I'm going to do a little micro lecture 5.3 on. We'll answer some questions about how it was conducted, and we'll answer some questions about it. Alright, what if the police become more predictive? In other words, what if they shift from being a reactive force to a proactive force? Well, one of the things they can do is they can find hotspots. They can find areas of high criminal activity, and then they can allocate more resources there. Some of this you'll hear called the geographical theory of crime, or the geographical theory of policing, where you map where crimes occur, how they occur, when they occur, and that's where you get resources. You don't have a patrol that's driving around at all times equally. A lot of this was implemented in New York City with the rise of something called CompStat, where they did a lot of computerized mapping. One of the interesting things they found is traditionally people wanted to believe that Central Park was an exceedingly dangerous area statistically. And in fact, after a lot of CompStat, they found that Central Park was not as dangerous as people thought. So what happens in New York is they map the data, they analyze the data in meetings, and then they change the deployment of their resources based upon this. So they are trying to predict where crimes will occur and when crimes will occur, and be there to stop the occurrence or rapidly catch the criminal. Okay, who to arrest? Reactive, again, arrests are when the police get a call and they show up and they arrest the person who committed the crime. That's great. That's what we expect. Proactive means that the police are taking the initiative. So this goes back to the community policing model that I referred to in previous chapters. The community policing model, part of the kind of sub-effect of this is the broken window theory. The broken window theory states that if you tolerate a house with broken windows, within a month or 2 months or 6 months, the house will be abandoned. If you tolerate the abandoned house in a month or 6 months, it'll become, say, a shooting gallery for drugs or a hangout for gang members. And this will impact the houses around it, and it will spread. So the broken window theory says the police should notice very small changes. If there's a broken window, if there's a public disruption, they will crack down on quality of life crimes. Say, okay, you got to get those windows fixed. You can't have a barking dog. You're going to really do some policing at a very, very basic level so that nothing grows into a bigger crime. And this continues to influence police strategy today. The broken window theory has been really central to the idea of community policing. So, community policing, again, you tolerate minor violations, will set a trend of greater. So, you have zero tolerance for these small things, you deal with quality of life issues, you improve the neighborhood. Alright, community policing then. We've talked about this, we've hinted about it, let's talk what it is. It's a philosophy that emphasizes community support for and the cooperation with the police in preventing crime. If you recall from our last lecture, we talked about Sir Robert Peel's statement, the police are the public are the police. The most effective police departments are those that have public support. If the public feels safe calling the police, helping the police, coming forward as witnesses, then the police will solve more crimes. So the return to the community promotes community partnerships, proactive solving, community engagement. So you're going to need local leaders and you're going to need goodwill. And this is really important. First of all, for example, when the police screw up. If the police make a bad mistake, they hurt someone they shouldn't, they get caught doing something bad, the general public, if they already have a very poor attitude towards the police, will turn against them. If, however, the police have been actively engaged in the community and most people in the community know that most police officers are good, then that goodwill that was banked can overcome police corruption or a bad shooting. But if there's none of this, then there's going to be the devil to pay when the police screw up. Problem-orienting policing. The philosophy requires the police to identify potential criminal activity and develop strategies to prevent or respond to that activity. You've got to know where potential exists, because remember, you want to solve crime before it occurs, or when it's very minor. If, for example, you knew, let's suppose that the theory, some people approach drugs and they say drugs are essentially an escalating cycle. People will do marijuana, and marijuana will lead them to cocaine, and cocaine will lead them to heroin. This is sometimes called the gateway theory of drugs. There's actually almost no scientific support for it, but if it was true, then you would focus on things like stopping marijuana addiction. And that would address the root cause of criminal behavior. So what is one of the causes of criminal behavior? Well, one of the ones that's fairly well benefited is boredom or lack of opportunity. So one of the things that the police have done is they have set up youth leagues and they have set up interaction with young adult males because they commit most of the crime. If you can get them doing things like playing midnight basketball leagues or being involved in day camps, they will not be out, or at least a percentage of them will not be out committing crime. So we encourage police officers to stop looking at their work as a day-to-day proposition and think about the future. Think about what things they could do to prevent future crime. Remember, don't be reactive, be proactive. Okay, how do the police see themselves? Well, we've talked a lot about how the public sees them. How do they see themselves? Well, one of the things I've experienced in my lifetime is I have seen students graduate from our programs. Sometimes I've written letters of recommendation that got them in the Raleigh Police Academy, or helped get them in. They got themselves in, let's be honest about that. And they went in as civilians, and they came out as rookies. And 2, 3, 4, 5 years, they were police officers, and they had changed. They had gone through a socialization process. They bled blue now. So eventually, if you're inside a culture like the police, or pick your culture, a monastery or the Marines or whatever all-encompassing thing you're in, you're going to be socialized to behave in a particular way. So the police face core issues and core things. They perceive danger. They're under stress. There's a degree of boredom in their job. There's a degree of violence in their job. And these things shape how the police respond. So the formal process is, of course, they have to want to become police officers. So there's already a pre-selection. A certain type of personality or personalities, probably several, want to be police officers. Then they apply for and are accepted at the Raleigh Police, or at the police academies. Then they're going to work with senior officers, their field training. They're going to make a felony arrest. They're going to use force. Maybe they will use deadly force. Most police officers won't, but they'll witness it. They'll also witness a major traumatic event. They'll see someone shot or hurt or raped. And all these will shape how a police officer thinks. And we talk about the blue curtain, or sometimes it's called the thin blue line or the blue line. And this is the value that police officers place on their shared relationship with other officers. They support each other because they view the rest of us as outsiders. They don't think we understand the police, and probably a grain of truth in this. Is it dangerous? Well, yes. The police come in contact with 40 million people per year. Now, most of the time, it's a relatively low levels of death or injury. There are more dangerous jobs in the United States. There are more stressful jobs in the United States. But it's a difficult job. There are aspects of police work and life that lead to stress. And some of these are obvious and direct. Some of these are not, like shift work. It's very difficult to go through life with a family and kids saying, okay, well, for these 3 weeks or whatever, if you're on what's sometimes called the DuPont schedule, a different schedule, for these 3 weeks I'm on midnight shift, and then for 3 weeks I'm on the 8 a.m. shift, and then for 3 more weeks I'm on the 2 p.m. shift. So you can have something that goes through, and that can be exhausting. And that's just a really minor aspect of stress. It's fairly common that police officers have difficult home lives. You can have burnout. You can have PTSD. Both of those exist inside policing. The use of force. Now, fortunately, this is relatively rare. If there are these 40 million encounters, only about 1%, 1.4%, if we want to be honest, 1.4% result in any level of violence. That is a relatively low number. Again, if we're looking at that, let me see, that's 24. That's about 600,000 a year, though. So overall, yeah, that's a lot. But that means if there's 800, 900,000 officers, only about 2/3 of them would be involved or come across any sort of violence. Now, use of force is a matrix. It is not either you shot someone or you didn't. One of the things we ask for is we ask the police utilization of force to be reasonable, proportional, and not excessive. If the police are going to use deadly force, and that's force that is likely or intended to cause death or serious bodily injury, then there has to be a very good reason for it. There are constitutional limits on what force the police may use, and here are just 2 quick cases, and if you take our constitutional law class, we'll focus on these more. Tennessee versus Garner, which is an older case, and Graham versus Connor, which is a little bit more recent. Tennessee v. Garner says that the police can use deadly force only when there's a threat of death or serious physical injury to the officer or to others. So you can't use deadly force to protect property, for example. You can use it in escape in certain circumstances, but not escape from arrest necessarily. Graham versus Connor really is, well, at what level is when the police use force, is it unreasonable? And the standard there is going to be, what would a reasonable man believe would be excessive? Not necessarily a reasonable police officer, but a reasonable man. It's a reasonable man standard, Graham versus Connor. Okay, the police are given all these jobs, they're given all these responsibilities, and we trust the police as a society. We give them a tremendous amount of discretion because we believe they're trustworthy. We believe that they have this unique training and experience, that they're experts in human behavior, and that they are charged with preserving not only their own life, but our lives as well, and our safety. So we allow them to make most decisions. But having said that, several hundreds, almost a couple thousand years ago, there was a Roman writer who asked a question. The Latin is quaes custodius custodias, who shall guard the guards? How do you keep an eye on the people that are keeping an eye on us? because we do know that those people that are watching us, the police, will sometimes be corrupt. Now, typically, we have allowed the police to monitor themselves. So most police departments will have something, either it's called this or close. It's called the Internal Affairs Unit. And that's made up of police officers, and they're supposed to watch the other police officers. Some police departments have some citizen oversight, but by and large the police as a group don't like this. They feel that the citizens watching police, they don't understand what's going on. And they've been able to maintain pretty much a structure where they watch themselves. Only in extreme circumstances or unusual circumstances do citizens really operate as the watchdogs of the police. One of the things that's most interesting technologically, and this goes to chronocentrism, is the emergence of first videotaping police. I very well remember way back during the Rodney King problems in Los Angeles, where we really had the first videotape of police beating a suspect, and then, unfortunately for them, lying about it in their police reports. Now that's not something that is unknown today, but of course we have hundreds of thousands of people using their phones to record people. We also now increasingly are having police officers with body cameras. So this technology is allowing a different type of policing, and it raises a lot of obvious questions. Okay, what penalties should there be for the police? Now, very rarely will, if a police officer makes a mistake, do they get arrested. Most of the time, what happens is the police decline, or the district attorneys decline to pursue criminal charges, and it's really up to the person injured or their family to sue. So you're either going to sue the police in federal or in state court, and there are specialized federal lawsuits. If you take the civil liabilities class that we teach, we'll talk quite a bit about 42 USC 1983, which is the U.S. Code section 1983 is what that is. It's Title 42. That's a federal cause of action for violating a citizen's basic constitutional rights. Now, again, police officers do not like these. They don't like to be sued. I don't think anybody likes to be sued. And I do think you need to be aware that most lawsuits against the police, even though a lot are filed, most fail for different reasons. All right, let's talk a little about some hot issues, hot button issues, I guess. Race, ethnicity, sexuality. Minority groups perceive a bias against them. So different groups over different times feel or have felt that they are held to a different standard than the general public, that they are over-policed. And it's certainly true that throughout time, police in America have been guilty of abusing minority groups. Whole departments have been subject to such investigation. And it is clear that there is or has been a bias, a racial bias, an ethnic bias, a sexual bias existing in the police departments. So why do the police misbehave? Well, one of the questions is sometimes they don't have perfect knowledge. They may not know the correct course of action. So sometimes when the police shoot someone and that person turns out to be unarmed, they didn't know he was unarmed, or they weren't properly trained for it. And that doesn't mean they won't be sued, or the city won't be sued for not training them, but they may not know the right thing to do. Sometimes the unethical choice is just very tempting. Sometimes, and this goes with this next one called noble cause corruption. Sometimes a police officer will do a bad thing because he wants to catch a bad guy. Ethical dilemmas typically involve conflicting ideas. How much discretion you give them, what their moral or legal duty is, conflicts with honesty, conflicts with loyalty, and these things interplay with each other to create problems. All right. Again, we came in right about 50 minutes. That's where I want. We'll pick up with Chapter 6 in our next lecture.